Well, just recently we celebrated the 400th anniversary of the death of William Shakespeare. Certainly the greatest writer in English, and I would say one of the 4 or 5 greatest artists the West has produced, period. I mean, like Dante, Homer, Michelangelo, Joyce, Thomas Aquinas. I mean, he just contained so much. Every nuance of thought and subtlety of feeling, aspirations to heaven, living in hell, everything in between. I mean, all of the human thing is on display in Shakespeare. And of course, it's the very capaciousness of Shakespeare that allows for so many readings of his work. Think of someone I really idolized, Lord Kenneth Clark, in Civilization, maybe with Macbeth's darkest soliloquies in mind, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage. It's a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Maybe with that in mind, I mean, he sees Shakespeare as a like the first of the modern nihilists. Something has fallen apart and nihilism holds sway. Or think of Freud's famous theorizing that in a play like Hamlet, he can see an anticipation of his own theories about sexuality and the Oedipus complex and so on. Or someone like René Girard, whom I reverence, and sees anticipation of his own scapegoating of violence theory and all of that in a lot of Shakespearean plays. Some feminists love William Shakespeare. Other feminists hate William Shakespeare. Some people see him as an avatar of radical social change. Others see him as the ultimate defender of the status quo. You've got Catholic readings, Protestant readings, atheist readings of Shakespeare. And, in a certain way, they're all possible because there's so much in him. I always go back to my friend, the late, great Father Edward Oakes, who was not only a great theologian, but a real bardophile. And he always smiled whenever he read Shakespeare interpretations and say, well, Shakespeare himself is like the Cheshire Cat. I mean, just his grin endures, but he hides behind the energy of his dramaturgy and the complexity of his characters, and we never really know what Shakespeare feels. And I think there's something, of course, deeply right about that. A lot of recent literature, and I think some of it quite compelling, has argued that Shakespeare was, in fact, Catholic, who was making his way through the dangerous ideological minefield of 16th and 17th century England. And there's a lot to that reading. There's a lot of evidence you could bring forward, and I'm not going to gainsay any of it. But I'm going to argue, for the sake of this video, for something a little more modest. Namely that Shakespeare, whatever his private views on religion were, was certainly mourning the loss of an integrated culture. Shakespeare knew that something of great beauty and value was falling apart during his time. And we see it in 1,000 ways in his plays that he's mourning that fact. You can prove it in a lot of ways, but I might just begin with the wonderful sonnet 73 that we love so much. That time of year thou mayest in me behold, when yellow leaves or none or few do hang upon those boughs, which shake against the cold bare ruined choirs, where late the sweet birds sang. It's a meditation on lots of things, on life, growing old, life compared to winter coming on, et cetera, et cetera. But as many have pointed out, those bare ruined choirs are also the empty choir stalls of the monasteries, which have been very brutally shut down, cleared out by Henry VIII. The sweet singing liturgical culture of the church that was fast evanescing in Shakespeare's time. And is he mourning that? Is he noticing the loss of this beautiful thing? Something else you can see in a lot of the major plays, I think, is some grand figure or established system that is being done to death by puritanical revolutionaries. And is Shakespeare mourning, again, the loss of these grand integrated cultures? One I can bring forward, of course, is the great play Julius Caesar. Here's Caesar, the grand old man, but who's killed by a band of puritanical and very determined revolutionaries. Think when they're standing over the body of Caesar, and they shout liberty, freedom, and death to tyranny. I mean, how often Shakespeare is anticipating there are the revolutions of the 18th century. How often we've heard the strains of revolutionaries putting to death an old system. they bathe their hands in Caesar's blood, and they look forward to their scene being enacted by people whose accents we don't even know, et cetera, et cetera. It's all the kind of glory of revolutionary violence. There's something a little bit frightening and overwhelming about the determination of these revolutionaries. But Shakespeare himself is not entirely sympathetic, I think becomes pretty clear in the Mark Antony speech. And also the fact that the murderers of Caesar are haunted relentlessly by Caesar's ghost until the end of the play. Now, is Caesar without guilt? No. In fact, I think the deafness of Caesar, which is a clear motif in the play, as symbolic, perhaps, of the deafness of the old Catholic culture that was unaware of the grumbling and the dissatisfaction within the country. Also, Caesar's arrogance is on pretty clear display. I'm like the Northern Star. I mean, almost every line of Caesar kind of invites someone to stab him. Because his arrogance is sort of overwhelming. I think of Owen Chadwick, the great historian of the Reformation, who said, everyone who mattered at the beginning of the 16th century felt the church needed reform. That includes Erasmus and even the saintly Thomas More. I mean, every thinking person knew the church shouldn't be deaf to the call to reform and shouldn't simply rest arrogantly on its laurels. There's something of that, it seems to me, in Caesar. Nevertheless, is Shakespeare less than sympathetic with those who do Caesar to death? Think, too, of the late play, The Great Antony and Cleopatra, which I think has some of the most sumptuous and lyrical language in all of Shakespeare. That he's sympathetic with these sort of grand old lovers, Antony and Cleopatra, I think is clear. They are winsome, they're romantic, they're sensual, they're funny, and they're deeply dysfunctional at the same time. Do they represent something of the old, colorful culture? And they are eventually done to death by Caesar Augustus, who's presented just as rational and as efficient and as humorless and determined. Is he something of the revolutionary novelty that's doing away with a flawed but wonderful and rich and densely textured culture? And we see a lot of it summed up in Shakespeare's greatest and most fully imagined character, namely Prince Hamlet. Do we overlook too quickly the fact that Hamlet has come back to the castle precisely from Wittenberg, where he's doing his studies? Well, what's Wittenberg but Luther's town? I mean, in some ways, it's the intellectual capital of Protestantism. That's where he's studying. And almost immediately, whom does he meet but a figure from Purgatory? He meets the ghost of his father. Well, Purgatory was disallowed by Lutheran theology. And so does Hamlet represent the sort of torn, riven character of England, and indeed of Europe, as it fights these two systems? And does this sort of anxiety and even suicidal depression of Hamlet not reflect this royal time in European history? In fact, I always think of those wonderful scenes, at the very beginning when the ghost of his father comes. Is that the ghost of the old Catholicism that's still haunting the minds of Protestantizing Europe? What does Hamlet's father talk about? The fact he's in purgatory, but also that he went to his death, but without the benefit of the sacraments and without being properly confessed, etc., etc. All these very Catholic motifs. And is he haunting Europe and England as he haunts Hamlet himself? So, am I arguing in a Catholic triumphalistic way that Shakespeare was clearly a Roman Catholic? I mean, I don't know. I'm too sympathetic with Ed Oakes that there's that Cheshire Cat quality, that we don't really know Shakespeare himself. But can we make the claim with some confidence that he is mourning the loss of an integrated culture? A culture that I would argue is worth putting back together.